What really creepy and paranormal stories have happened to you? One of my brothers worked as a security guard at one of the most upscale hotels in New York City. During one of his night shifts, security received a desperate call. It was a guy. He was really scared. He said his wife was lying in the bathtub, not breathing. My brother and another guard rushed upstairs to the room. Indeed, they found the woman in the bathtub, and she was without signs of life. My brother and the other guard pulled her out of the tub and attempted CPR. Meanwhile, during the CPR attempt, the NYPD arrived. The police officers told my brother to stop giving her CPR because the woman was clearly dead, and in their opinion, she had been dead for hours. Her husband was questioned extensively. He told law enforcement that he and his wife had gotten into an argument earlier in the evening. He left the room alone, and when he returned, his wife was in the bathtub. He said that when he returned, he went to bed, but later became concerned that his wife was still not coming to bed by any means. There was an opinion among everyone present that the husband had something to do with it, but it was impossible to prove his guilt. A couple of weeks later, visitors moved into the room. Of course, they were not informed of the incident. One woman who stayed at the hotel often moved into the room for a week. She was the first person to check in after the incident. She came to the front desk in the morning, very angry and disgruntled, along with her luggage. She said that she wanted a refund and that she would never stay at this hotel again. When asked the reason for this sudden desire, she reported that she had been up all night and that the room was haunted. No one at the hotel had told her about what had happened earlier in the room. While my brother was working there, every guest who checked into that room reported strange occurrences there. Many asked to be moved to another room. Changed. I asked my brother to tell me more about this story. He said that many guests reported hearing water noises, like someone splashing around in the tub. Anyway, next time I want to stay at any hotel, I'll ask them to put me in a room where no one died. It was close to Halloween. My friends and I were sitting together and telling each other scary stories. My friend started telling a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling that story since it was really real, but we convinced her to tell it after all. Let's cut to the chase. Her parents were on their first and slightly awkward date when suddenly a man, my friend's father, suggested we go for a walk in Provo Canyon. He knew the area well, as he had hiked there quite often. So the two of them drove up to the bush of the canyon, got out of the car, and hiked under the light of the stars since it was high moon. At one point, the man gets a bad feeling as the trail ahead, which is under the trees, is very dark and the time is quite late. He ignores the feeling and keeps moving forward. Years later, my friend's mom told me that she had the same feeling at that moment. So, after a minute, that pressing feeling came back to the man. He ignored it again and stepped back a bit toward the trees. When his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path, it was too dark under the trees to make out what the soft thing was. In that moment, the feeling was stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what it was he'd stepped on, he and his woman had agreed to get the hell out of there. Years later, after being married for a while, they were watching an interview with serial killer Ted Bundy. When Bundy was asked when he thought he was closest to getting caught, he told the story of how he had lured a girl into Provo Canyon one night and killed her when he suddenly heard some people coming down the trail. He managed to hide behind the trees. At the very moment, some guy stepped right on the girl's corpse and for some reason just turned around and walked away. I worked in a nursing home as an assistant in a hospice unit. I had other nurses working with me. We always tried to make each other laugh to try to get through the night. I often scared my coworkers. Sometimes I would hide in the closet of a ward where someone had recently died, press the call light, and wait. The girls would come in and hurriedly turn on the lights, and then I'd jump out and scare the hell out of them. One night, I was in the nurse's station, filling out a report. Then a nurse comes running in and says she thought she saw my shadow by the counter, like I was hiding there to scare her. But then she heard me laughing in the nurse's station. I decided to go outside and check it out. When I got to the counter, there was nothing there. I laughed as suddenly this nurse started squealing. I turned around and saw a shadow that quickly scurried down the wall around the corner. I just looked at my coworker and said, "Oh, for goodness sake, that's the best you could come up with," and walked back out to the nurse's station. A while later, I had to make my rounds. As I approached a patient's room, I heard 3 knocks on the door leading to the patio next to that room, and I saw an elderly man, dressed all in black, behind the glass door. I couldn't let him in because I didn't have an access code, so I told him to wait a minute. and I would ask the nurse to let him in. When she and I went back to the door, he was gone. She went outside, but we couldn't find him. So I went back to my patient's room. When I went in there was blood everywhere. The patient was lying on the floor, bleeding. It looked like he tried to get up, but he fell down. We put him back in bed, but after a while he died of cardiac arrest. Just a few minutes later, we go to another patient's room. He's dead too, just stopped breathing. We called his family and the morgue. As I was going to get new bedding, I saw an old man I had seen earlier on that patio. He walked by the counter and whispered, "Another one, my name, and then I'm done for the night, one more." I flinched because his whisper was incredibly creepy, and the old man went somewhere with quick steps. I followed him and saw the door of one ward swing open. The long corridor was empty. The old man could only go in there. I run to the ward, looking around. There's no one inside except the patient, but then I noticed that the patient, an old woman, chained to the bed, is looking right at me. I went over to her to check her pulse, but there was none. She was dead too. When another nurse came in, she swore she too heard eerie whispers and saw an old man in all black. Don't read too long. I worked as a paramedic in a hospice unit and ran around the hospital while death took our patients one by one. She killed 3 in one night. A few weeks ago, my girlfriend and I were sleeping together when I woke up to something she said. "What are you doing?" Sometimes she talks in her sleep, but this phrase of hers sounded so clear and insistent that I woke up and asked what she was talking about. Then she woke up and said she thought she saw someone at the foot of the bed. I figured it was just a dream, or she just imagined it since she was already dozing off. We didn't pay any attention to it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up and saw that someone was standing beside our bed, wrapped in sheets and with their neck unnaturally twisted. I didn't know what to do, but the first thing out of my mouth was, "What are you doing?" I was then woken up by my girlfriend. When I told her what I had seen, she said she had dreamed the same thing. I don't know. It's probably the power of suggestion or something, but it's still super creepy. When I was a kid, my family was very poor and lived in an old trailer on a piece of land that belonged to my grandfather. This piece of land was in a very small town in the middle of nowhere in Texas and was almost completely covered with forest. The town itself was a typical small country town where the only entertainment was soccer, and a lot of people still got wasted on the weekends. It was in the 90s. Our town was so backwoods and relatively quiet that no one here ever locked their doors at night or installed an alarm system. Our trailer had 2 bedrooms, and our parents slept in the living room on a fold-out couch. One night, when everyone had already gone to bed, Dad wakes up to the feeling that there is someone in the room. He looks around a bit and sees a large male figure sitting in a chair a few feet away from the bed. My dad immediately turns on the light and sees our neighbor named Carter, who lived down the street. Carter, as far as everyone knew, was a frequent substance abuser and was constantly in trouble with the law because of it. My father asked him what the hell he was doing here and told him to leave, but Carter replied, "I can't leave. I'm being haunted by demons in your house, the only safe place." My father, who is a rather large and intimidating man, said that if Carter doesn't leave this house this minute, this place is no longer safe. If I go out, they will grab me. They've been after me all night. If they catch me, I'll die. My dad replied that there were no demons, but if Carter didn't get the hell out of our house, he would definitely die. Then my mom woke up and also started threatening Carter, and while she may not be as big, she was just as intimidating as my dad. I still think it was her anger that ultimately scared Carter away. My father got up, locked the door, and watched through the blinds as Carter left. Since Carter thought he couldn't escape the demons on his own, he stole our car, a Chevy Bourbon Chevy, which my father always left the keys in. He drove it around for about an hour. We called the police. It took them about that long to get to us since the nearest police station was about 20 or 30 minutes away. Carter eventually got our car back, was arrested, and sent to the lockup. He was deemed insane and was eventually placed in a psychiatric hospital. Then the worst part began. When he was released, he started calling us. All we heard on the phone were his words, "I'm gonna fucking kill you." He called us for years, also following us from house to house. Even though we always had different numbers, we even changed states, but he still somehow found our address and phone number. The calls stopped when I was about 12. I found out later that around that time, Carter decided that the best thing he could do was to pour gasoline on himself and set himself on fire. When I was a kid, I had an imaginary friend who lived in a very large and old dresser in my room. We used to hang out there together a lot, and I vividly remember him telling me stories, even though I don't remember them at all now. I remember talking about my friend to my parents one day, and when I started telling my father about my new friend from the dresser, my father wanted to know his name. It was some perfectly ordinary name, like Tom or John, but I still remember how quickly my father's face turned pale. The next day, my father and uncle took that dresser out of my room and burned it in the street. It wasn't until years later that I learned that my uncle had the exact same imaginary dresser friend with the same name when he was little. After a few months of interacting with him, my uncle started having the most horrible nightmares. My uncle couldn't sleep because of his friend. It got so bad that their family had to move that dresser out of the room, after which my uncle got better, changed. My dad was the only one who believed my uncle. Their parents didn't care much about the situation. To anyone who asks, what did my friend look like? He looked like a small man, but with very long arms and fingers, which in turn led to the fact that even today, I draw people, and I always get their hands longer and larger than usual. I don't know if you could call this story creepy, more like touching. I don't know. My mom has 2 kids, me, the youngest, and my older brother. But before we were both born, there was Jonathan. He was a cute, little, blue-eyed blonde boy, known for liking to repeat daddy's swear words in church. He was a normal, healthy kid, did well in school, and often played outside with his friends. When he was almost 6, he was riding his bike, fell, and hit his head on a rock. He got up and said he felt fine. The next morning, my mom found him in bed. When she wanted to wake him up, she saw that he was very sick. One of his pupils was dilated, and the other was normal. He was immediately taken to the nearest hospital. At this time, Jonathan's best friend Nick was sitting at his house eating breakfast and eating cereal. Suddenly, Nick gets up from the table and walks to the door. When his mom asks him what he's doing, Nick replies that Johnny called him from the street. You see, Nick and Johnny lived in different neighborhoods, and they weren't yet allowed to cross the street without their parents, but their houses were close enough that they could call out to each other on the street. So Nick is walking to the street corner when his mom gets a call from my mom informing her that Johnny has just passed away in the hospital and brain neurism caused by a fall. Nick's mom has a hard time taking this news and wonders where her son has gone. But Nick returns a few minutes later and says he just ran into Johnny. His mom looks outside, but Johnny is nowhere to be found. Nick sits down at the table and continues eating his cereal. Then Nick's mom asks him what Johnny said. Nick replies that he came to say goodbye. My mom told me this story when I was little, but I still remember it. I wish I could have met Johnny, but honestly, I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't have written this story if he hadn't died. The thing is, my mother only wanted 2 children. I'm grateful for the chance he gave me. Sometimes I think he died for me. I'm not religious, but I feel a spiritual connection with Johnny. I was visiting my family over winter break in Los Angeles. It was about 5 years ago. I was on my way to the bathroom on the 2nd floor of my aunt's house when I saw my cousin April on the stairs. She was 4 years old, and she was a very active little girl. She was sitting on the stairs making funny faces. I asked her what she was doing. She said, "I'm following the girl." I looked around, and there was no one else here but us. I asked, "Where is that girl, April?" She pointed to a beam that was parallel to the stairs. "And what is this girl doing?" April said, making funny faces. I smiled and went back up the stairs when April said something that made me stop. "She's hanging on to her hair." I turned around and asked April to repeat what she just said. April pointed to that spot. "The girl is hanging from her braids, and she's making faces." Then April started squirming her face, and I realized that she had been showing a face like she was choking the whole time. It wasn't until years later that my aunt told me in confidence that a woman had hanged herself in that house when they didn't own it yet. Then I asked her where it had happened, and she told me the very place April had pointed to. Me and my friends were driving home from a concert. It was about 7 years ago or so, in the neighborhood of Cerritos. There's an elementary school there. For what it's worth, we drove past the local elementary school. We were all joking around, laughing and doing what 16-year-olds usually do. Suddenly, one of our friends started looking at the playground outside this school. She then screamed and refused to talk to us for several more hours. We asked her what happened, what she saw, but there was no way we could get her to tell us. We all thought she saw someone on the playground or a dead body or something. All we knew was that she was seriously scared. As background, I should add that she was very sensitive to paranormal phenomena. I myself don't believe in ghosts and the like, but whatever. In her old house, doors were constantly swinging open by themselves, hangers flying off their seats, mugs and plates falling off the table and breaking. Anyway, there was crazy shit going on there all the time. Anyway, eventually, she told her boyfriend about what she had seen. She said she glimpsed a crowd of bloody people walking aimlessly around the playground. I immediately put it down to her being tired, because it was about 2 in the morning when we drove past that spot. Later we learned that in the late 80s, an airplane had fallen on this very school and killed many people. My parents told me that when I was a kid, I would go into the bathroom in our house and just start laughing. They thought maybe I was playing in there or something, but when they would check on me, I would just stand there, looking at the tub, smiling and giggling like an idiot. My mom finally asked me what I was laughing at. "It's a woman," I replied, laughing wildly. Turns out, this happened quite often in my childhood. I would walk into the bathroom and start laughing. My parents were very frightened by this, because before us, there was an old woman who had lived in the house and died in this very bathtub. I was too young to remember it, but my mom still freaks out when she talks about it. Personally, I'm a little nervous now and hope I never see that woman again. For starters, my husband and I are looking after my uncle. He is very old and can hardly do anything on his own anymore. Sometimes the cleaning lady comes to check on him and feeds his old cat. So we arrive at his house, but there is no way we can find the cat. We have cats ourselves, so we know that often when a cat dies, it tries to hide. We get worried and start looking for this cat. We check all the rooms, under all the beds, and everything. So I open up the closet in one bedroom and look through the stuff on the floor. I move a few things around and see someone's feet on the floor of the closet. Clothes were covering everything above them. The feet had beautifully painted nails, looked quite human, but for some reason, I thought it was a doll. We looked around a couple more places, and suddenly the cat was in the middle of the living room. He was fine. We locked the house and left. My husband and I went to dinner, and then a movie, but there was no way I could stop thinking about those feet and how real they seemed. At the time, my husband and I had just gotten married, so I didn't want to seem crazy, so I didn't bring it up. But after a few hours, I still decided I needed to tell him everything. My husband also thought it was probably a doll, but suggested we go back and check it out anyway. When we got back, I just stood in front of the door of the house because I was scared. My husband saw my reaction and realized it must be something serious. He goes inside, picks up a sharp iron poker from the fireplace, and goes into the very bedroom where I saw those feet. He walks quietly so he can't be heard, opens the closet door, and sees the same feet with painted nails on the floor. He pokes lightly at the foot with the poker, and the toes clench. Then he hits the foot with the poker as hard as he can and yells, "Get out of here!" Out of the darkness of the closet comes a woman in her 30s with a cat and a can of Coke in her hands. It turns out this homeless woman had been living in my uncle's house for several months. We called the police and she was arrested. It happened to a friend of mine. She told me about it about a year ago. Let me call her Minji here. Minji is about 20 years old. She works as an English tutor in South Korea. One evening, a few years ago, she was tutoring a high school student. They started the tutoring session quite late. Soon the buses stopped running. Being far away from his home, the boy asked if he could sleep on her floor for the night and take the first bus the next morning. Minji didn't really want a teenage student to spend the night with her. It didn't seem like a good idea to her, but he had begged her for it really hard, and she had finally relented. They were in her studio apartment. She got into bed, and he spread out a blanket on the floor. They both fell asleep. A few hours later, at about 2 a.m., "Boy Will Minji, I'm very hungry," he says. "Let's go get something to eat." Minji opens his eyes and looks at him incredulously. "Eat now? It's 2 in the morning. Go to bed." But the student starts to insist. "No, I'm very hungry. Let's go get something to eat." She tells him there's ramen in the kitchen and he can make himself some. The boy doesn't agree. He doesn't want ramen. He says there is a 24-hour restaurant nearby. Eventually, after a few minutes of persuasion, Minji agrees to go to the restaurant with him. They leave the apartment and head out. Once they are outside, the boy turns to Minji and says, "I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw under your bed there was a man sleeping there." They called the police, who discovered that a homeless man had been living under Minji's bed For over 2 months, the boy was only able to see him because he was lying on the floor of her room. The police arrested the man, and thankfully, there were no other problems. But this is, by far, the creepiest thing that has ever happened to anyone I know. A few years ago, my brother got a call on his cell phone around 2 or 3 in the morning every night. He answered and heard some hellish sounds in the receiver, static mixed with horrifying infernal screams. After a month, he changed his cell phone number and it stopped. Then, about a week later, it started again. Exactly the same sounds at exactly the same time. Finally, one day, he decided to call the number back. He was answered by an old man who had no idea what my brother was talking about. Nevertheless, the calls continued. If he didn't answer, the phone would ring a few more times. No messages came to him. One day he said screw it, terminated his contract with the phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. As you might have guessed, the static and screaming noise continued after a short delay. Because of this, he was terrified every night. There was no way he could figure out why this was happening. He called the number back again and was answered by a person who also didn't understand the calls my brother was talking about. It was around this time that he lost his job and his phone. The calls stopped, of course, because he didn't have a phone and he was in no hurry to buy a new one. So one day, my mom comes up to me and asks me to listen to a strange message she received on her home phone. It was static noise with hellish screams. We showed this message to my brother and he was totally shocked. He called the number back again, but this time, the number was invalid. We never received such calls after that, and thank you all for watching. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and served on a base in Japan. For a while, he really enjoyed his time there, girls and all. He made friends with some Japanese guys his age who worked on the base. On those nights, when he and his fellow soldiers had the weekend off, the local Japanese guys would show them around the neighborhood, take them to bars, introduce them to girls, and so on. One night, a Japanese guy invited my brother home to play video games. My brother accepted the invitation and they played video games for a few hours. Then the Japanese man tells my brother that the main reason he wanted to go home early was because his little sister was suffering from nightmares that caused her to wake up screaming, crying. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had a seizure. Now, I'm going to explain how this Japanese guy's house was set up. It was shaped like a U. There was a small garden between the rooms. So between the guy's room and his sister's room was this garden. If he looked out of his window, he could see her, and vice versa. Anyway, they decide to finish playing, and the Japanese guy goes to the window to peek through the garden into his sister's window to check on her. He lifts the curtain and looks out for a split second and then jumps back with a scream and looks at my brother as if he has just seen something horrible. My brother then goes to look, but the Japanese man stops him. He tells my brother that he saw some dark cloud with red eyes looming over his sleeping sister's body. My brother naturally doesn't believe him and decides to take a look for himself. He quietly creeps to the window and lifts the curtain, but this time finds himself face to face with what he describes as a dark black club of smoke with a face. My brother and another guy run in terror to the Japanese man's sister. They then sat under blankets until the wee hours of the morning. I don't know if my brother can be 100% believed, but every time he tells this story, he looks like someone who has seen something truly sinister. About a couple weeks after I was born, my dad's best friend, Jim, died. They were very close friends. Jim's last wish was to hold the newborn baby of his best friend, me, in his arms. His wish came true, and a short time later, he was gone. Fast forward 7 years. I was a happy 7-year-old kid. I have a 5-year-old brother and a newly born sister. One day, the phone rang in our house. Our mom and dad were in the bathroom, getting ready for work. I thought we kids would just ignore the call because we were still very young to answer the phone. Our phone didn't display the number of the caller. It could be a stranger, but my brother broke the rules and answered, "Hi." At this point, my dad came out of the bathroom and asked my brother to hand him the phone. My brother ignores this request and continues to listen to whoever called us. Before my dad can ask a second time, my brother hangs up, looks at him, and says, "Jim says hi," and says he really misses my name. What I remember most is the shock that was on my father's face. When I was in 8th grade, I went on a school trip called the Louisiana Tour. We got to visit the most important landmarks in South Louisiana. One of the places we visited was Myrtle Plantation, which is considered to be haunted by a whole bunch of ghosts. Basically, it's the most haunted place in the country. There are all sorts of stories about this place. So at one point, we were all standing in one room as part of a large group, and the female guide was talking about something. As I'm standing there, I start to hear what sounds like someone pressing a piano key. After hearing this a couple times, I started looking for the source of the sound. I didn't see a piano anywhere, but I kept hearing it. Afterward, I asked my friends who were standing next to me, did they hear it? They said no. When I heard it again, I said I was hearing that sound again, but they still didn't understand what I was saying. They thought I was crazy. So I went back to looking around the room. All the people's eyes were fixed on the guide, except for one woman. She caught my gaze and pointed questioningly at me and then at her ear. I realized she was asking if I had heard it. I nodded. The tour guide then begins to tell a story about a soldier who died there and how he loved to play the piano here. Many visitors reported hearing him play at night. Honestly, I didn't know what to think. I guess I still don't. I talked to that woman as we were all leaving the room. She said she heard piano sounds, but her husband and son said they didn't hear anything.